This video introduces evolution and the theory of natural selection. Evolution is an extremely important theme in this course. It's a unifying theme that's woven throughout the course. It explains all unity that we see in life. It also explains all diversity that we see in life. What is evolution? Evolution is simply changes that take place over time. It's really a simple idea. Populations change and species change. A population is a group of members of the same species living in the same area at the same time, whereas species is a group of individuals that has the capability of mating and producing fertile offspring. Here we see some early evolution views. These views were all held before the time of Charles Darwin. Many people believe that Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. It's not true. Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection, the mechanism by which evolution works. Here we see some views that were held before the time of Charles Darwin. One of the first scientists I want to discuss is named Cuvier. Cuvier was one of the first paleontologists. Paleontologists are scientists that study fossils. Fossils led to many of our early ideas of evolution. Fossils really show us two things. One, that species used to exist that don't exist today. And two, that species exist today that didn't used to exist. These fossils are located in different strata of rock. Cuvier was an important scientist that led to the ideas of evolution. However, Cuvier believed in something called catastrophism. Cuvier believed that the reason that you saw different fossils in different strata of rock was because of natural disasters that took place, where all the species that existed at that time went extinct. Hutton and Lyell were two very important geologists. They studied the rock within the earth. Hutton came up with the idea of gradualism. Hutton said that the earth is gradually changing over time. Lyell furthered this with the idea of uniformitarianism. Lyell said that the earth is gradually changing at a steady or a uniform rate. The ideas of Hutton and Lyell were really important to Charles Darwin. Darwin thought that if the earth was gradually changing over time, why wouldn't the different species on earth also be changing over time? Lamarck was an early scientist that came up with the first mechanisms of how evolution takes place. Lamarck's ideas are really important because they're the first theories of how evolution takes place. However, his theories are mostly incorrect. The only idea of Lamarck's that was actually correct is his idea of use and disuse, or use it or lose it. Lamarck said that parts of the body that are used heavily will be accentuated, and areas of the body that are not used are going to be reduced over time. And this makes sense because the body is not going to waste energy maintaining a structure if it's not in use. Lamarck's second idea is called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. We know today this is not true. Lamarck said that characteristics which were created over an individual's lifetime would be passed on to their offspring. So Lamarck said that if a giraffe reached out its neck in order to grab leaves really high on a tree, that it would produce offspring with longer necks. We know that this is not true. Here you see an example that goes against the theory of acquired characteristics. Here we see a bonsai tree. Bonsai trees are trees that have been groomed to become very small. However, a bonsai tree would not reproduce and create small trees. Instead, a bonsai tree would produce a normally sized tree, going against the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Lamarck's last idea, which is also incorrect, is the natural transformation of species. He believed that each species naturally goes from being more simple to more complex. Extinctions did not take place, speciation does not occur. We know that this is also not true. Evolution does not always go towards a greater complexity. Now we begin discussing Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is an extremely important scientist. He created the theory of natural selection, the mechanism by which evolution takes place. As a boy and into adulthood, Charles Darwin was extremely interested in nature. He first went to school to study medicine. He dropped out and then studied theology at Cambridge University. After graduating, Charles Darwin went on a 5-year unpaid journey as a naturalist on the boat, the HMS Beagle. Here you see a picture of what the Beagle looked like. Most people think the Beagle just went to the Galapagos Islands. It's not true. The Beagle really traveled all over the world. Charles Darwin was a true naturalist. As they went to the different areas of the world, Charles Darwin drew pictures of the different species that he saw. He collected specimens. He took notes. Obviously, the most famous place that Charles Darwin visited was the Galapagos Islands. You see them right here. And based upon his observations on the Galapagos Islands and his journey across the rest of the world, Charles Darwin came up with his theory of natural selection. His theory of natural selection was described in a book that he wrote called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. This book was published in 1859. In his book, Charles Darwin referred to evolution as descent with modification. Charles Darwin only used the word evolution one time in his entire book. Charles Darwin described evolution, or descent with modification, as a generation-to-generation change that takes place in a population. He said that the population is constantly changing to become better adapted to the environment. This mechanism by which the population changes to become better adapted to the environment is called natural selection. So to Charles Darwin, the environment was the driving force of natural selection. The environment produces selection pressures, meaning the environment controls what traits are most beneficial. The environment is going to drive these changes that we see take place in a population over time. Here you see two different populations of rabbits living in different environments. This environment on the left is much more hot, it's much more arid. This environment on the right here is much colder. If you look at rabbits that live in the hot environment, they're going to have much larger ears that are used to dissipate heat. That's going to allow this population of rabbits to be able to control their body temperature. If you see the rabbits that live in the cold environment, they're going to have smaller ears, preventing the loss of heat, and they're going to have much thicker layers of fur, insulating their bodies, keeping all that heat inside of them. So you can see here that the environment is the driving force that produced changes in these two different species of rabbits. Here you see a picture of the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands contain 13 different islands. Each island has its own unique environment that has its own unique selection pressures. A good example of a selection pressure is the type of food located in an environment. Here you can see on 3 different islands we have 3 different food sources. Island A, you have the cactus, B, you have insects, and C, you have seeds. You can see that having a different food source drove the evolution of different species of finch in the different environments. You can see that finches that live in the environment that contains the cactus are going to have beaks which are equipped for consuming the cactus. Finches that eat insects are going to have thin beaks that are able to pluck the insects out of a tree. And finches that eat seeds are going to have thick, robust beaks that will allow those beaks to crack open those seeds. So you can see here that the environment drove the evolution of different beak sizes in these different groups of finches. Darwin's theory of natural selection has 4 components. Component number 1. Organisms are capable of producing huge numbers of offspring. Darwin formed this idea based upon an essay written by Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus's essay stated that the human population is growing faster than the resources. Number 2, there is large amounts of genetic variation in every population. That genetic variation is inheritable. Here we see a population of ladybugs, and you can see that within this population there is a lot of genetic variation in the number of spots and the color of their shells. Number 3, environmental resources are limited. There's limited amounts of food, limited amounts of shelter, limited amounts of mates. So when you have a large number of organisms, each of those organisms has a high level of genetic variation, and you have environmental resources that are limited. This is going to drive competition for those environmental resources. There's a struggle for existence. There's competition created. Finally, those individuals that have traits which make them best adapted to the environment, which means makes them best adapted or best able to obtain the food, best able to obtain the mates, best able to obtain the shelter. They are going to be the individuals that survive, and more importantly, they are going to be the individuals that reproduce. Natural selection is a generation to generation change in the number of individuals who have a particular trait. Natural selection is the differential inheritance of genes. These are genes that code or that determine these traits that are most beneficial. Charles Darwin is the most important scientist to know within this chapter of evolution. Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection, the mechanism by which evolution works. As a boy, Charles Darwin was extremely interested in nature. He first studied medicine and then studied theology at Cambridge University. After Charles Darwin graduated, he took a 5-year unpaid journey as a naturalist on a boat called the HMS Beagle. Here you see a picture of the HMS Beagle. Most people believe that Charles Darwin only went to the Galapagos Island. However, we know today that Darwin traveled all over the world. He visited areas of Africa, areas of South America, Australia, and obviously the most famous place that Darwin has ever visited was the Galapagos Islands. After Darwin's journey, here we see Charles Darwin. Darwin is the most important scientist to know within the chapter of evolution. Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection, the mechanism by which evolution works. As a boy, Charles Darwin was extremely interested in nature. He first studied medicine, which he studied unsuccessfully, and then theology at Cambridge University. After graduating, Darwin took a 5-year unpaid journey as a naturalist on the boat called the HMS Beagle. Here we see a picture of the HMS Beagle. Most people think that the Beagle only traveled to the Galapagos Islands. However, you can see that the HMS Beagle actually traveled all over the world. As the HMS Beagle traveled across the globe, Charles Darwin worked as a naturalist. He drew pictures of the different species that he saw, he collected specimens, he took notes. Obviously, an extremely important region that he went to was the Galapagos Islands. You can see the Galapagos Islands here off of the coast of South America. Based upon his journey, based upon the observations that he made, Charles Darwin wrote a book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. In this book, he detailed his theory of natural selection, the mechanism by which evolution works. So how does evolution work? Charles Darwin referred to evolution as descent with modification. He actually never really used the word evolution in his book. Instead, he described descent with modification as a generation-to-generation change in a population. He said that the population changes to become better adapted to the environment. The mechanism by which that population changes is called natural selection. So to Darwin, the environment is the driving force of evolution. The environment creates what we call selection pressures, meaning that it controls what traits are most beneficial in the environment. Here you see two different groups of rabbits. One rabbit that lives in a hot, arid environment, and one rabbit that lives in a much cooler environment. You can see that the environments drove the evolution of different characteristics in these rabbits. The rabbits that live in the hot environment are going to have much larger ears, which are used to dissipate heat. Rabbits in the colder environments are going to have much smaller ears to keep the heat in. They're also going to have much thicker coats to serve as insulation. You can see here that the environment drove the evolution of different traits in these two different groups of rabbits. Here you see the 13 islands that make up the Galapagos. Each island has its own unique environment that has its own selection pressures. A good example of a selection pressure will be the food source. You can see on one island here there's the cactus, another island here there are insects, and on a third island there are seeds. By having different food sources on the different islands, this drove the evolution of different shapes and sizes to the beaks of the finches that lived on these islands. Finches that lived in the cactus island are going to have beaks that make them better adapted to consuming the cactus. The finches that lived on the island that contains insects are going to have long, thin beaks that allow them to extract the insects out of the trees. Finally, finches that lived on the island that contains seeds are going to have very thick, robust beaks that allow them to break the seeds open. You can see that the environment was the driving force that created different beak shapes and sizes in the different groups of finches that lived on those islands. Darwin's theory of natural selection has 4 components to it. Number 1, populations tend to produce more offspring than the environment can sustain. Darwin came up with this idea based upon an essay that he read from Thomas Malthus. In Thomas Malthus's essay, he stated that the human population is growing far faster than the resources allow. Number 2, that those offspring are variable in appearance and function. There is a high level of genetic variation, and variation is going to be the fuel for natural selection. Here you see a population of ladybugs, and you can see just how much variation there is in traits like the number of spots on their shells. We know today that this variation is created through genetic recombination. Number 3, environmental resources are limited. There's limited amounts of food, limited amounts of shelter, limited amounts of mates. By having a large amount of individuals who are all variable in appearance and function and limited resources, this is going to create competition among the members of a population. This creates competition for those limited resources. There's a struggle for existence. Finally, those individuals that have traits that make them best adapted to the environment, best able to get food, best able to obtain mates, best able to get shelter, those are going to be the individuals that survive, and more importantly, those are going to be the individuals that reproduce. Generation after generation, you see a change in the population towards there being more and more individuals with these beneficial traits. So the population is changing in its proportions over time. Another way to say this is that there is a differential inheritance of genes. Really, natural selection is a difference in the ability to pass on your genes, where generation to generation, more beneficial genes are passed down to each generation. So here you see the components of natural selection. You have overproduction of offspring. You have genetic variation. You have a struggle for existence, and this leads to differences in reproductive success. This is going to cause the evolution of a population by means of natural selection in order to become better adapted to the environment that they live in. Darwin really focused on adaptation. Darwin believed that adaptation to the environment can lead to changes within a population, and it could also lead to the formation of new species. As these populations evolve to adapt to their environment, changes are going to build up within those populations. When so many changes build up that those two populations can no longer mate and produce fertile offspring, we now see the creation of new species. Darwin explained 3 broad observations that we see in life. Darwin's theory of natural selection explains the unity of life. All organisms share characteristics in common. This is because all organisms share a common ancestor. Differences build up as these populations become better adapted to their individual environments. Darwin's theory of natural selection explains the diversity that we see in life. Darwin really focused on adaptation. Darwin believed that adaptation to the environment can cause changes within a population, and it causes the formation of new species. We just learned that populations are constantly changing to become better adapted to their environment. When 2 different populations are changing to become adapted to their different environments, differences will build up in those populations. Eventually, those populations can become so different that they can no longer mate and produce fertile offspring. When this takes place, we now have the formation of new species. Through his theory of natural selection, Darwin was able to explain three observations. Number one, he was able to explain the unity of life. All life shares certain characteristics in common. This is because all life shares common ancestry. The differences that build up in life, the diversity that we see in life, is caused by populations changing to become better adapted to their environments. This drives the formation of new species. Darwin's theory of natural selection also explains the match between organisms and their environments. They have the traits that they contain because those traits allow them to be well adapted to their environments. Here we see two different species of praying mantis, one that lives in Malaysia, one that lives in Borneo. Both praying mantises are going to share certain characteristics in common. They share characteristics in common because they share common ancestry. The differences that you see between these mantises are caused by the different environments. The different environments have different selection pressures that drive the formation of changes that allow these mantises to become better adapted to their environment. Here you can see the evolution of camouflage. You can see that the praying mantises on the left blend into the flowers that they occupy. The praying mantises on the right here blend into the leaves that they occupy. You really see the match between organisms and their environment. In a Darwinian view, the history of life is like a tree with branches representing life's diversity. You can see that life shares common ancestry. And you can see the branching out of all new species as those species become better adapted to their individual environments. Here you see a diagram showing the complete diversity of life. And you can see that all life shares common ancestry. That all of life is broken down into two groups of prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And you can see all of life's branching points where species diverged into new species. Those divergences were caused by populations changing to become better adapted to their environments, driving the formation of new species over time. Alfred Russel Wallace is an important scientist. He came up with the same idea of natural selection at the same time as Darwin. Most people think that they competed to release their idea first. In reality, Wallace sent his ideas to Darwin, and they decided that Darwin's ideas were more developed than Wallace's, so Wallace let Darwin publish first. So multiple people were coming up with these ideas at the same time. Here you see a timeline showing all these different ideas and when they came about. All right, here you see early on, you see Hutton's ideas of gradualism. You see Malthus's essay on population growth in humans. You can see that Lamarck published his hypotheses at the same time that Darwin was born. You can see Cuvier's studies of fossils. You can see when Lyell published his Principles of Geology. You can see when Darwin traveled across the world on the HMS Beagle. And here you can see where where Wallace and Darwin were creating the same ideas around the same period of time. 1859 is when Darwin published his book on the origin of species by natural selection. There are several good examples and studies showing natural selection in action. One study that shows natural selection in action is the study of beak evolution in the medium ground finch. you can see that the average beak depth over the finch is going to constantly change as the environment changes. In years that are drier, the nuts that the finch consumes are going to become much harder. All the finches that have thick beaks will be the finches that are able to obtain food, survive, and reproduce. You can see in this drier years, the average beak depth of the finch increases. During wet years, the nuts are not as hard to break open, and you can see the average beak depth of the finch decreases. Another great example of natural selection in action is antibiotic resistance in bacteria and drug resistance in viruses. Bacteria contain a high level of genetic variation through mutations that take place. When an antibiotic is given to a colony or a group of bacteria, it'll probably kill about 99% of the bacteria. 1% might naturally have the variation that allow it to be resistant to that antibiotic. Those are going to be the bacteria that survive. Those are going to be the bacteria that reproduce. Bacteria reproduce extremely quickly, so over a very short period of time, the entire population can evolve to become resistant to the antibiotic. Viruses are also constantly evolving to become drug resistant. A good example of this is the HIV virus. We've created numerous treatments for this virus. A good example of a treatment is a drug called 3TC. 3TC inhibits reverse transcriptase. However, HIV contains natural variation in this enzyme, and certain HIV viruses have a reverse transcriptase that is resistant to the 3TC drug. These were the viruses that survived. These were the viruses that reproduced. And again, over a very short period of time, the entire population of HIV evolved to become resistant to this drug. Finally, my last example of natural selection is the peppered moth evolution that took place during the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, industry released a lot of pollutants into the environment, and as a result, trees became darker as they were covered with soot and other material. You can see that there is natural variation in the wing color of the peppered moth. You see some peppered moths are much lighter, some peppered moths are much darker. During the Industrial Revolution, all the light-colored moths would have been easily visible and would have been killed by predators. The darker moths would have blended into their environment. They would survive, they would reproduce. Over a period of time, the entire population would change towards there being more and more dark-colored moths. Darwin noticed in human beings that we caused the process of natural selection to take place in other organisms. However, nature was not determining what traits were being selected for. Instead, we were. We call this artificial selection. A good example of artificial selection took place with a plant called wild mustard. You can see all the different groups of vegetables that were created using this wild mustard plant. We were able to accomplish this by selecting for various traits. For instance, by selecting for leaves, we were able to create the vegetable kale. What we did was we took all the wild mustard plants that had the largest leaves, we bred them. The next generation, we took all the wild mustard plants that had the largest leaves, we bred them. We did this generation after generation until all the plants contained really large leaves. You can see that each of these vegetables had a different trait selected for. There are many different pieces of evidence of evolution and many different ways to study evolution taking place. One of those methods is called biogeography. Biogeography is the geographical distribution of species, studying where species are located. Modern species are found where they are because they evolved from ancestors that inhabited those regions. They contain the traits that they have to become better adapted to the environment that they live in. Paleontology is the study of fossils. Paleontologists study different fossils found in different strata of rock. The different strata of rock are these different layers that you see, and each layer or each strata represents millions of years. By studying the different fossils found in the different strata, scientists can look at the progression of different species over time. Species found in earlier strata or lower strata are going to be older. Fossils found in higher strata are going to be newer. You can see how we tracked the step-by-step evolution of the modern baleen whale using the fossil record. By looking at fossils found in different strata, we are able to track all the transitional species that existed from the extinct cousin that existed about 48 million years ago all the way up to our modern baleen whale today. We've even been able to discover things like the ancestor to the baleen whale was actually a terrestrial mammal, a mammal that lived up on land. It might have even resembled a little bit, looked a little bit like a modern day wolf, I guess you would say. We can study evolutionary relationships by looking at comparative embryology. Comparative embryology looks at all the different stages in embryonic development. Most animals begin development looking very similar. Here we see a picture of a cat embryo and a human embryo, and you can see that they both start out looking very, very, very similar. All animals begin having a tail. You can see the tail there. All animals begin with structures that look like gills. As these animals go through embryonic development, these structures are lost. The closer related two species are, the more stages of embryonic development they will share in common. So you can study the number of stages in common to determine how closely related two species are. Since humans and cats are both mammals, they are going to share many of the stages of embryonic development in common. However, if you were to look at a human versus a fish, they are going to look very different right away during embryonic development. Comparative anatomy is going to study anatomical structures shared in common, and these anatomical structures are studied in order to determine evolutionary relationships. Comparative anatomy really focuses on homology. Homologies are similarities due to common ancestry. In particular, comparative anatomy studies homologous structures. Homologous structures have the same structure, but they have a different function. They are proof of common ancestry. Here you see four different types of vertebrate animals. We have the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat. Here we're looking at their forelimbs, and you can see that each animal uses their forelimb for a different purpose. The human uses forelimb to grasp and manipulate objects. The cat uses it to walk or run. The whale is going to use it to swim. The bat is going to use it to fly. So all four of these animals are adapted to totally different environments. However, if you look, they have all the same bones in all the same places. This shows that these four animals all evolved from a common ancestor. Since they evolved from a common ancestor, they share homologous structures in common. However, they look different because they are adapted to different environments. The opposite of a homologous structure is an analogous structure. A good example of an analogous structure is comparing the wing of a bat or a bird to the wing of an insect. They look very similar because they're both adapted to the same environment. However, since they don't share a close common ancestor, they are not going to share physical structures in common. You can also look at the pectoral fin of a whale versus the pectoral fin of a shark. Again, they look very similar because they're both adapted to the same marine environment. However, since they don't share a common ancestor, they are not going to share a similar structure. Whales have bones like we do. Sharks have a skeleton made up of cartilage. Very different. Vestigial structures are also evidence of evolution. They are leftover pieces from past ancestors. Looking back at our whale here, the whale actually has some pelvic bones and a femur, remnants of legs. However, we know that whales do not have legs and they do not walk on land. These are leftover pieces from their past ancestor. Snakes also have femurs. They have leg bones, even though they don't have legs. This shows us that snakes evolved from another reptile that has legs. Also on the human, we see the tailbone called the coccyx, also a vestigial structure left over from the time when our ancestors had tails. So you can see vestigial structures are leftover pieces from past ancestors. Finally, our last piece of evidence to support evolution is molecular biology. Scientists study molecules shared in common, in particular DNA and amino acids. Scientists actually determine the number of base pairs of DNA shared in common between two different species. Closely related species are going to have more base pairs in common. More distantly related species are going to have less base pairs shared in common. Scientists can also do the same thing with amino acids. Here you see a diagram comparing the number of amino acids that differ from a human hemoglobin polypeptide. The human and the rhesus monkey have about 8 amino acid differences in their hemoglobin polypeptide. Between the human and the mouse, there's about 26 amino acid differences. Between the human and the chicken, you have 45. The human and the frog, you have something like 60. The human and the lamprey, you have at least 125 differences. From this information, we can gather that humans are more closely related to the rhesus monkey. They're a little bit less related to the mouse, less to the chicken, less to the frog, and least related to the lamprey. We could use this information to determine, points of divergence when two different species formed from a common ancestor, and we could study evolutionary relationships. This concludes our lecture on Intro to Evolution and Natural Selection. Thank you.